I walked into my 30th birthday party and then my parents put me on trial, handed me DNA results, demanded $500,000, took my car keys, and let my sister live stream it. And then a man they swore was dead stood up and changed everything forever that night. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Nadia. I'm 30, and I'm telling you right now I have seen people die in front of me on a hospital floor, and still nothing prepared me for walking into my own birthday dinner and realizing it wasn't a celebration. It was a public execution dressed up in chandeliers and dessert menus. And the worst part is I didn't even understand it at first, because when you've spent your whole life being the responsible one, your brain keeps trying to turn cruelty into a misunderstanding just so you can survive it. So picture this with me. I'm in Lagos for work training that week, and I fly back the same day because my little sister Kira calls me for weeks earlier, sounding like she swallowed fireworks. "Nadia, don't be mad. I wasn't supposed to tell you, but Dad is actually doing something big for your 30th. And I laugh because in my family the phrase "something big for you" has always meant "we need something from you." But she keeps going, breathless. They booked the private room at the Meridian. They invited everybody, even Anna Mo from out of town. Everybody is coming, and I'm standing in a break room with fluorescent lights humming like a mosquito and a vending machine that eats money. And I just stare at my coffee like it might give me better parents, because in 30 years, nobody has ever thrown me anything, not a party, not a surprise, not even a proper hug that lasts longer than a polite tap. But for Kira, my parents have done productions. Her 21st was a whole red carpet thing, photographers, speeches, my dad calling her my princess, and my mom crying like she won an award, while my birthdays were always "come eat and stop making noise." So when Kira says they're doing all this for me, a part of me gets stupidly hopeful, like my inner child stands up from the corner she's been sitting in and whispers, "Maybe they finally see you." And that's the part that makes me angry now, because hope is expensive when your family charges you for love, and I should have known it was a setup from the very first detail, because Kira adds, "Dad said you must act surprised and you must dress nice and you must come early." And then she giggles and then she goes quiet and then she says, "Oh, and he said he has a special gift for you, like a speech moment, so don't be late." And that speech moment is where my stomach should have started screaming, because my father only does speeches when he's controlling the story. He's the kind of man who doesn't talk. He performs, he doesn't apologize, he just rewrites reality until you feel crazy. And I'm telling you this because I need you to understand the atmosphere I walked into. This wasn't random chaos. It was planned, rehearsed, practiced like a courtroom play. And in the days before the dinner, I did what I always do. I ran numbers. I counted what I'd sent them over the years. I did the same thing I do at work when a patient's vitals are unstable. I checked the facts, because feelings lie, and the facts were ugly. I had been sending 500 every month since I started earning properly, 7 years straight. No gaps, no drama, just transfer and silence, because my parents always had some pressure, some business slow, some emergency. And I didn't even question it because they trained me not to. Meanwhile, Kira is 30 months younger than me and somehow still finding herself every year of her life. Still in their house, still needing support, still getting handed money like it's a love language, and I'm the one they call when they need adult solutions. So yes, I was hopeful about the party, but I was also suspicious. And that suspicion got louder 3 days before the dinner when my manager tells me, "Nadia, you're being considered for senior charge. You've earned it, but they want a recommendation letter from someone with a strong network." And my manager casually says, "Your father used to be connected to the hospital board, right?" And I almost choke, because that's the thing. My father loves connections. He loves being somebody. He loves being the gatekeeper of other people's futures. So I call him, and he answers like he's been waiting, too cheerful, too ready, and I say, "Dad, I need a recommendation letter." And he goes, "Of course, my girl. I'll write it. I'll hand it to you at your birthday dinner, in front of everyone. Let's make it special." And I remember freezing with a phone pressed to my ear, because he never calls me my girl. That's Kira's title. And I should have realized right there that he wasn't giving me a gift. He was building a stage, and I still ignored it, because I've ignored warning signs my whole life. I ignored the way my mother would praise Kira's mediocrity like it was genius and treat my excellence like it was expected. I ignored the way she would say, "You're strong," as a compliment when it was really a license to neglect me. I ignored the way my father would only speak warmly to me when he needed me to cooperate. And I ignored it because you can't function if you constantly admit the people who raised you don't actually like you. So fine, I buy a dress, navy blue, elegant, nothing loud, because I'm not trying to compete. I'm trying to look worthy, and I even buy a small gift for my parents like an idiot, a photo album with pictures of us across the years, because some part of me still thinks if I present evidence of my love, they'll finally give me theirs back. And on the day of the dinner, I'm in my apartment getting ready, smoothing the dress, fixing my hair, doing makeup in that careful way that says, "Please don't humiliate me today." And right as I'm about to leave, I see Kira outside in her car, phone raised, recording my old Honda like it's a celebrity sighting, and I walk over and I'm like, "Why are you filming my car?" And she smiles with that sweet mean grin she's had since childhood and says, "Nothing, it's cute. Can I borrow it sometime?" And because my mouth has been trained to say yes before my brain even gets a vote, I say, "Sure." And she nods like she just secured a contract, and then she says, "Don't be late, the room is full, Dad will be mad." And as I drive to the Meridian, I feel that cold slither of dread in my belly, the kind you feel before a bad shift, before a patient crashes, before you walk into something you can't reverse. And I keep trying to talk myself out of it. I keep saying, "It's your birthday, Nadia. It's a dinner. They're doing something nice." And I literally rehearse my surprised face in the rearview mirror like a clown, because I wanted this to go well so badly it's embarrassing. And then I arrive, and the entrance is glossy, marble floors, warm lights, the smell of grilled meat and expensive perfume. The hostess smiles and says, "Patterson private room?" And I nod, and she gestures down the hallway, and I hear muffled voices, and my brain goes, "Okay, good, people are here, it's real." And then I push open those doors, and the world stops in the most unnatural way, like someone hit mute on a movie, because 75 faces turn to look at me at the same time, and not one of them smiles. No balloons, no music, no surprise, just a heavy wall of silence and staring. And the first thought that hits me is, did someone die? Because that's the vibe. Funeral energy. And I look for my parents, and there they are at the front of the room behind a long table like judges, and on the table is a single red folder, centered like a weapon, and my father is holding a microphone, and my mother's posture is rigid like she's been practicing righteous anger in the mirror. And Kira is off to the side with her phone already up, screen glowing, and I swear on my life my feet keep moving because my brain can't accept what my eyes are seeing. So I walk forward and my heels click too loud, like the room is amplifying my humiliation, and my father speaks into the microphone, calm, cold, performative. "Nadia, sit. Not happy birthday. Not we love you, just sit." And I sit because the chair is positioned facing them like I'm in court. And I feel my heart start pounding because my body understands before my mind does. My body is screaming, "This is danger." And my father opens the red folder and pulls out papers and holds them up for the room like he's presenting evidence. And he says, "We invited everyone here as witnesses." And there's a murmur, and I turn my head and I see aunties and uncles and cousins and people I haven't seen since childhood. And nobody is looking at me with love. They're looking at me like they're watching a scandal unfold. And my mother says, "We are done being taken advantage of." And I blink because my brain is still trying to interpret the language, and my father says, "We did a DNA test." And the room moves, chairs creak, someone gasps, and I laugh once, a tiny shocked laugh because it's absurd, and I say, "What?" And he says it again louder, "A DNA test." And then he drops the bomb with the kind of satisfaction that tells you he's been waiting to say it. "You are not our biological child." And my entire stomach drops like I missed a step on a staircase, and my mouth opens but nothing comes out, and my mother leans forward and says, "We took you in, we raised you, we fed you, and you repaid us with disrespect." And my father flips to the next paper and slides it across the table, and it's a spreadsheet, dates, amounts, categories like food, school, clothes, housing, and he says, "We calculated what it cost to raise you." And he taps the bottom line with his finger like he's proud of the math. 480,000. And the room makes that collective sound people make when they're excited about drama, and he says, "And we want it back." And I swear my vision narrows, like the room shrinks to just the folder and my parents' faces, and my mother reaches across and snatches my car keys from my hand so fast, I barely register it, like she's done it 100 times in her head, and she raises the keys and says, "This too." And I finally find my voice, but it comes out cracked. "That's my car." And she smiles. Not warm, just sharp. "You got your job because of your father's connections. You owe everything you have." And I look at my father because surely he will say that's enough. But he just nods like a man watching his plan work. And then Kira pushes her phone closer to my face, and I see the red live icon, and my blood turns to ice because she's not just recording, she's broadcasting, and she whispers excited, "Say something." The comments are flying. And I turn my head, and I see faces in the room suddenly lift. Phones appearing, people recording. Because in 2026, even family betrayal needs content. And I want you to pause right here with me and tell me the truth. If this happened to you, would you cry? Would you swing? Would you freeze? Because I froze, not because I'm weak, but because my brain was trying to reconcile 30 years of we're family with 5 minutes of pay us back. And I'm sitting there feeling like my life is being auctioned off. And then something in me kicks on like a switch. The ICU part of me, the part that gets calm when alarms scream. And I start looking for patterns, for lies, for the weak point, because every manipulator has one. And right at that moment, I notice something that doesn't fit. A man in the corner near the emergency exit, not dressed like my relatives. Expensive suit, calm posture, the kind of stillness that says he's not surprised, he's waiting. And next to him is a woman holding a thick folder like she's a professional. And my eyes keep dragging back to them, because that man is watching me like he knows me, and I point and I ask my father, "Who is that?" And for the first time his face flickers, not anger, fear, and he snaps, "No one," too fast, and I feel the room shift because everyone sensed it, that tiny crack in his control, and I look back at the man, and he takes one slow step forward like he's done with the warm-up, and right then, before I tell you what he said, drop a quick comment and tell me where you're watching from, what city, what country, because I need to know I'm not alone in this, and I promise I actually read what you write and then listen because my father thinks he can get the room back. He lifts the microphone and does what he always does. He performs, "Family, tonight we are setting things right." And some people nod like trained birds, and he says, "We opened our home to a child nobody wanted." And I almost choke because "nobody wanted" is a cruel phrase to say about a person sitting right there, and he says, "We sacrificed." And my mother adds, "We did everything for you." And Kira's phone is still pointed at me, and the comments are probably eating me alive. And my father slides a contract across the table, big bold heading, promissory note, and he says, "Sign." And I stare at it, and I see monthly payment terms, and my brain does the math in a flash. This would own my life. This would chain my future to their bitterness. And he leans in, voice low now. Private threat inside public shame. "If you don't sign, I will call your hospital. I will tell them you're unstable. I will ruin your promotion." And I feel the room tilt again because that's the first time he says the real reason, not money, control. Because if he controls my career, he controls me, and I take a breath, and I ask the one question that changes everything, because it's the only thing that matters in that moment. "If I'm not your biological child, who are my biological parents?" And my mother answers too quickly, "Dead." And my father echoes, "Both dead, car accident." And I watch his mouth and I hear the lie in it, because liars rush. They over-explain, they shut doors fast, and I say, calm, slow, loud enough for people to hear. "DNA tests need comparison samples," and the room murmurs because the logic lands, and I continue. "If my parents are dead, whose DNA did you compare mine to?" And my father's eyes dart to the man in the corner like he forgot the audience is intelligent, like he forgot facts exist. And my mother's hand tightens around my keys, and Kira whispers, thrilled, "Oh my God, this is getting good." Like she's watching a show instead of destroying a sister. And then the man in the corner finally speaks, not shouting, not dramatic, just calm power slicing through the room. "Gerald," he says, and my father flinches at his own name like it's a slap, and the man says, "Not yet." And the whole room goes silent so fast you can hear a spoon clink. And my father's face drains, and my mother whispers, "Who let him in?" And the man takes another step, and I swear my lungs stop working because something about him feels familiar. And I don't mean his face exactly, I mean his eyes, the shape, the expression, the way they hold sadness without apology. And he looks straight at me, and I feel this weird, irrational certainty, like my body recognizes him even if my mind can't. And my father tries to recover. He lifts the microphone like a shield and barks, "Security, but nobody moves, and the man says, "I'm not here for a scene. I'm here for the truth." And my mother's mouth opens and closes like she's trying to find the right life fast enough. And Animo, my mother's sister, stands halfway up like she's about to stop something and then sits back down because cowards always sit back down. And my father turns to me, voice sharp with panic now. "Sign the document, Nadia." And I look at the pen, and I look at my mother holding my keys like she's holding my freedom, and I look at my sister filming like she's filming my burial. And I look at that man again, and he's closer now, close enough that I can see the wetness in his eyes, and he says my name softly, like he's been holding it in his mouth for years. "Nadia." And my father's jaw tightens and he hisses, "Don't," like he's warning the man, like he's afraid of words, and the man says, "You told her I was dead." And I feel the air leave the room because that sentence changes the shape of everything, and my father's face turns gray, and my mother's lips go thin, and my sister's phone wobbles for the first time, and I stand up slowly, chair scraping, and I hear whispers ripple through the crowd like electricity, and I'm not crying, not yet, because shock is a weird anesthesia, and I look at my parents and I say, "You didn't invite 75 people to celebrate me." And my voice is steady in a way that surprises even me. "You invited 75 people to trap me?" And my father tries to laugh it off. "Don't be dramatic." And I cut him off. "You used my birthday as a weapon." And my mother snaps, "After everything we did for you." And I point at the man, "And after everything he did for you?" And my mother's eyes flick to the woman with the folder, and the woman opens it like she's been waiting for her cue. And that's when I realized this was never just family drama. This was evidence. This was legal. This was the kind of situation where my parents thought humiliation would keep me obedient. But they didn't account for one thing. The truth had already walked into the room, and it was wearing a suit, and it wasn't scared of them. And the man takes one more step, and the woman beside him holds out the folder like a judge passing down a sentence. And my father's microphone hand starts to shake. And I look at my sister, and she's still filming, but her smile is gone now because she finally understands this might not make her famous. It might make her a villain. And I turn back to the man and I whisper, barely audible, "Who are you?" And he answers with a calm that makes my skin prickle, "I'm the reason they're panicking." And then he looks at my father and says, "You don't get to charge her twice." And my father tries to speak, but nothing comes out, and I swear the entire room leans forward at the same time like a crowd watching a verdict, and my mother tightens her grip on my car keys, and I realize she's not holding keys. She's holding her last little piece of control, and I take one step forward, and then another, and then I hold my hand out, and I say to my mother, very softly, "Give them back," and she scoffs. "Or what?" And I smile, small, cold, because in my head I'm already seeing the dominoes lined up. I'm already understanding that this dinner isn't my trial anymore. It's theirs, and I say, "Or you'll find out what happens when the people you've been lying to finally get the receipts." And that word receipts hits the room like a match, because half the aunties flinch like they know something. And my father's eyes snap to them like he's checking who might fold. And the man in the suit says, "Since you love witnesses so much, Gerald, let's use them properly." And the woman beside him pulls out a stack of documents thick enough to break a table, and I don't even know what's on them yet, but I can feel it. I can feel the shift, the power sliding away from my parents like oil on water, and my sister's phone keeps recording, and for the first time in my life I'm grateful for her stupidity, because whatever happens next, nobody gets to rewrite it later, and my father opens his mouth to regain control, but the man beats him to it and says, "Nadia, before you sign anything, ask them one more question." And I turn back to my parents and my voice drops into a quiet that makes people listen, and I ask, "If you're so sure I'm not yours, why are you this desperate for my signature tonight?" And my father's face twitches and my mother's nostrils flare and the crowd murmurs because they can hear the crack in the story now. And Kira whispers, "Wait, why do they need her signature?" And she sounds confused for the first time in her life. And my father's eyes dart again to the folder, to the man, to the witnesses, and I realize the answer is going to be ugly, and it's going to explain everything, and the man in the suit steps fully into the light, close enough now that I can see the same shape in his cheekbones that I see in my own face in the mirror, and he says, "Because if you don't sign," she doesn't just walk away. She takes something back that you've been living off for years. And my father's lips part. My mother's hand finally loosens on my keys like her fingers lost strength, and the whole room holds its breath waiting for the next sentence, because everybody can feel it, the moment where the truth stops being hinted and starts being spoken. And I'm standing there in my navy dress realizing my birthday wasn't the day my family celebrated me. It was the day they underestimated me. And the next thing that comes out of that man's mouth is going to change my name, my past, my future, and the way every single person in that room looks at my parents forever. The man in the charcoal suit didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because authority isn't volume, it's certainty. And he looked at my father like he'd been counting down to this moment on a calendar for decades and said, "Gerald, you brought witnesses, good, because witnesses are exactly what you're going to need when she asks the next question." And my father tried to laugh. That fake little, "You don't scare me" laugh men do when they're terrified, and he tightened his grip on the microphone like it could save him. "Sir, you are not welcome here. This is a private family matter." And the man tilted his head and said, "Family matter, yes, which is why you lied about her family." And the room made that small collective inhale, the one right before people start pulling out their own phones, and my sister Kira, still filming, whispered into her mic like a sports commentator, "Guys, this is insane. This is actually insane." And I wanted to snatch the phone and throw it in a pot of boiling oil. But then I realized her stupidity was doing me a favor, because for once in my life, my parents couldn't edit the story later. And then the woman beside the man stepped forward, crisp, professional, the kind of person who says good morning like it's a contract. And she placed that thick folder on the table right next to the red one my father had staged like a weapon. And the contrast was almost funny. My father's folder looked like drama. This woman's folder looked like consequences. And my mother still had my keys clenched in her hand, but her knuckles were whitening like her body was realizing she might have to release control, and she wasn't built for that. And my father leaned forward and hissed at me through a forced smile like we were still playing Happy Family for the crowd. "Nadia, ignore them, sign the paper, and we can end this quietly." And I stared at him and I thought, quietly? You mean quietly for you? Quietly like you've been quiet about the truth for 30 years. Quietly like you've been quiet every time you took my money and pretended it was help. And out loud I said, "You want me to sign because you're scared of what's in that folder?" And he snapped, "I'm not scared of anything." And the man in the suit said, "Calm. Then let's open it." And my mother's mouth twitched like she wanted to scream, but didn't want to look hysterical in front of 75 people. So she did what she always does. She went for character assassination. She pointed at me and said, "She has always been dramatic. She's always been ungrateful. She's always tried to turn people against us." And I swear I heard a couple aunties murmur agreement, because some families don't need facts. They just need permission to hate you. And my father jumped in. "Exactly. She's twisting this. This man is a stranger. He's trying to scam her." And the man smiled, not friendly, more like a shark showing you at his teeth. And he said, "A scammer wouldn't bring receipts and attorneys." And then, like a movie cue, the woman beside him pulled out a laminated ID and said, "My name is Amaka IB, attorney." And a few people gasped because the word attorney changes the vibe instantly. Suddenly, it's not gossip, it's legal. And my father's jaw tightened and he said, "We don't need lawyers. We are her parents." And Amaka looked him dead in the eye and said, "You are adoptive guardians under a compensation agreement, not her biological parents. And tonight you attempted coercion in a public venue, including theft of personal property and threats of workplace interference." And the way she said it was chilling because it was clean and clinical, like she was listing symptoms. And my father swallowed hard because he knew that wasn't just talk. That was language that ends up in court. And my sister Kira whispered, "Wait, compensation agreement." Like she was hearing a new word. And my mother's face flared. "There is no compensation. We raised her out of kindness." And the man in the suit stepped fully into the light and said, "Kindness doesn't come with monthly transfers." And I felt my chest tighten, because the moment he stepped forward I saw it again. That familiarity, the eyes, the cheekbones, the quiet pain, like he'd been carrying a heavy bag for years, and he was finally allowed to put it down. And he looked at me, and his voice softened for the first time. "Nadia, my name is Victor Dermola." And the entire room reacted to the name like it meant something, because it did. I could see it in the way a few uncles shifted, the way one aunt covered her mouth, the way my father's eyes went slightly wild, and Victor continued, "And I am your biological father." And I swear the world did this weird slow-motion thing where sound drops out and you can hear your own heartbeat, because I wasn't prepared for it to be said that plainly, not because I didn't suspect, but because hearing it makes it real. And my mother screamed, sharp and panicked, "He's lying," and my father shouted, "Security." And again, nobody moved, because even the staff could sense this wasn't a drunken argument. This was something bigger. And then my father did the most predictable thing in the world. He tried to regain control by grabbing the microphone and turning to the crowd. "Everyone, please, this is a personal matter. This man is trespassing and harassing my family." And Victor didn't flinch. He just reached into his jacket and pulled out a set of documents. And he held them up like a mirror, and he said, "Your family, Gerald, is built on a lie you've been paid to maintain." And the crowd murmured, "Phones fully up now." And I glanced at my sister's screen, and I could see comments flying, people typing so fast it looked like rain. And I wanted to vomit because my humiliation had become entertainment again. But then I remembered something. If truth is going to come out, I'd rather it come out loud than buried. And Victor looked at me and said, "I didn't come to take over your life. I came to give you your life back." And my father barked, "Nadia, don't listen to him. He abandoned you." And the word abandon hit me like a trigger because my parents have used that word my whole life. Every time I questioned anything, every time I asked why I felt different, why my baby pictures were weirdly limited, why my birth certificate was lost, they'd say, "Your real parents didn't want you." Like it was a leash, and Victor's face tightened at the word, and he said, "I never abandoned her." And my mother laughed, bitter and loud. "Then where were you? Where were you when we were feeding her and paying school fees?" And Victor nodded once like he expected that line, and he glanced at Amaka, and Amaka opened the thick folder and slid out a stack of papers so thick it looked like it could stop a bullet, and she placed it in the middle of the table and said, "Wire transfer records, 28 years. And she flipped the first page toward the crowd so people could see numbers and dates. And my father's eyes flicked down, and his face did something ugly. It wasn't just fear. It was being caught, like a thief watching the owner walk in, and Victor said, "Every month, Gerald, you were paid." And my mother snapped, "It was not payment, it was support." And Victor replied, "Support is when you help someone who needs it. Payment is when you take money and still treat the child like a burden." And that sentence made the room shift. Because people can tolerate a lie until you connect it to cruelty, and then it gets uncomfortable. And I heard one aunt whisper, "So they were collecting money?" And Uncle Tund, my father's friend who always defended him, frowned and said, "Gerald, what is this?" And my father raised the mic again like a shield. "It is nothing, it is private." But Victor cut through him. "It's not private when you tried to extort your daughter in public." And then Amaka added, "For the record, Mr. Patterson, we have a copy of the adoption and compensation agreement signed by you and your wife, and we have proof. You breached it." And my mother's hand jerked like she'd been slapped. "Breach? What breach?" And Victor looked at me, and I could see wetness gathering in his eyes, and he said, "The agreement required you to tell her the truth at 30, to allow contact, to stop hiding her identity." And the room erupted into sharper whispers because now it sounded like a movie plot. But my father's face was telling the truth. He looked like a man realizing the story he wrote has a different ending. And my sister Kira whispered into her camera, "Guys, they had an agreement to keep her from her real dad until 30, what the hell?" And people in the room started reacting to that because even messy relatives have a line, and hiding a parent for 30 years is a line. And I stood there staring at my parents, and the only thing I could manage was, "You told me he was dead." And my mother snapped, "Because you were better off." And I laughed, one sharp laugh that sounded wrong in my throat. "Better off." And my father interrupted, trying to sound reasonable. "Nadia, calm down. We did what we had to do." And Victor's voice dropped lower. "Dangerous. No, you did what benefited you." And he nodded at the documents. "You received money. You used her as a prop in your home. You favored your biological child, and you still had the audacity to demand $500,000 from her tonight." And my mother screamed, "Because she's ungrateful." And I turned to her and said, "Ungrateful for what? For being treated like a backup generator in my own house. And some people actually laughed. Nervous laughter, because truth wrapped in humor hits harder. And I kept going because once you start, you can't unsee it. Ungrateful for paying your bills while you called me dramatic? Ungrateful for sending money every month while Kira posted selfies and got applause, and my sister flinched at her name being pulled into the light, and she tried to speak. Nadia, I cut her off. Don't. And then I looked at my father. You threatened my job. And he snapped. I was trying to teach you respect. And I said, you weren't teaching respect. You were blackmailing me. And the crowd murmured again because people understand blackmail. They understand coercion, they understand a man trying to crush his daughter for control. And then Amaka held up my car keys receipt that I didn't even know she had, and she said, also, the vehicle is registered in Nadia's name and was purchased through her financing, so returning the keys now would be wise. And my mother's mouth opened, and for a split second, she looked like she might throw the keys at my face, but she didn't. She slowly placed them on the table like she was forced to put down a weapon, and I picked them up with my own hand, and that tiny act felt like oxygen, like reclaiming 1 inch of my life. And then my father tried his final trick, the one manipulative parents always use when they're losing. He turned his voice soft. He addressed me like I was a child. Nadia, we raised you, we love you, we were going to make it right. This is just misunderstanding. And I stared at him and said, a misunderstanding doesn't come with a promissory note and a live stream. And someone in the back coughed. And Victor said, Gerald, stop insulting her intelligence. And my father's face hardened again. Fine, then let's talk business. And he gestured at the documents like he could spin them. If you were sending money, it was for her care. It wasn't enough. Raising a child costs more than that. And Victor smiled like he'd been waiting for that exact excuse. Good. So you admit it was money for her. And my father blinked, realizing he'd trapped himself, and the room reacted. Little sounds of awe. And because people love watching someone step on their own lie. And Victor continued, and since you love calculations, let's calculate. And Amaka pulled out a summary sheet and read it out loud. 1,500 per month for 28 years equals 504,000. And the room went dead silent because that number mirrored the one my father had just tried to put on my head. And Victor looked at me and said, they already got their 500,000. Nadia, they just wanted to squeeze you for another. And I felt something rip inside me, not sadness, rage, clean rage, because that means every time I thought I was earning love, I was paying rent in my own family. And I said quietly, so all those years you were taking money meant to make sure I was cared for, and you still treated me like I was lucky you tolerated me. And my mother snapped, you were lucky. And the room reacted. A few people gasped because she said the quiet part out loud, and Victor's face twisted with grief. And he looked at me like he was trying to apologize for something he didn't do, and he said, your mother Catherine begged me not to fight too hard because she was afraid they'd move you somewhere I'd never find you. And my chest tightened at the name, Catherine, because it sounded like a real person, not a ghost story. My parents used to scare me, and I whispered, my mother. And my father cut in fast, your mother is dead. She didn't want you. And Victor's eyes flashed, don't. And the entire room felt it, that warning. And then Victor reached into his inner pocket and pulled out an envelope. Old, slightly worn, and he held it like it was sacred, and my throat closed because I knew without knowing, and he said, she wrote this for you. And my mother lunged forward half a step like she wanted to snatch it, and Amaka blocked her with a simple sideways move that screamed, not today. And Victor held the envelope out to me, and my hands shook when I took it, and the room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning, and I could feel every eye drilling into my face, and my sister's phone was still recording. And for once I didn't care because this wasn't content. This was my blood, my origin, my truth, and I slid my finger under the flap and opened it carefully like it might break if I rushed. And inside was a letter, handwriting smooth, feminine, real. And I started reading and my vision blurred almost immediately because the first line was, my Nadia, if you're holding this, it means you're finally old enough to know I never let go of you in my heart. And my lungs collapsed, and I had to swallow hard to keep from making that ugly sobbing sound in front of 75 people who didn't defend me 5 minutes earlier. And I kept reading silently, lips moving, and the words hit me like warmth and grief together. Like someone finally saying the thing I needed my whole life. You are wanted. You were loved, you were not a burden, and I pressed the letter to my chest without thinking, because my body did it before my mind, and Victor's voice softened. She died when you were 5, and my knees went weak, and my mother muttered, "Drama." But her voice had no power now, and one aunt actually said, "Linda, stop," which shocked me because I'd never heard anyone tell my mother to stop. And then, like the universe wanted to keep piling on, Aunt Saud, my father's older cousin, stood up trembling and said, "Gerald." I knew there was money, and the room snapped toward her, and my mother's head whipped around like a snake. "Sit down." And Aunt Saud said, "No," and her voice cracked. "You used me to collect transfers in cash sometimes. You said it was insurance. You said not to mention it." And my father shouted, "Stop talking." And she said, "I'm tired." And then she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm sorry." And that apology hit me harder than all the yelling because it confirmed what I always suspected. People knew. They just stayed quiet because silence is easier than integrity, and the room started splintering, murmurs turning into arguments, questions flying. "Gerald, is this true?" "Linda, you lied? So you staged this dinner?" And my father tried to regain control, but the crowd doesn't listen to you when the spell is broken, and Victor leaned slightly toward me and said low, "I didn't come for revenge, Nadia. I came to stop them from trapping you into a signature that would follow you for years." And I looked down at the promissory note and then up at my father and said, "You can tear that paper up yourself." And my father's face twisted. "You think you're free?" And I smiled, small and deadly. "I already am." And I turned to Victor, swallowing hard. "I can't call you Dad." And Victor nodded immediately like he expected that. "I don't need a title," he said. "I just need you safe." And then Amaka leaned in and said, "Nadia, one more thing. We have a second document that explains exactly why they needed your signature tonight." And my father's head snapped up, eyes wild, and he said, "No." And my mother started shaking her head like denial could erase ink. And Amaka looked at me and said, "Your father and mother took out a loan years ago using your name as guarantor without full disclosure. And tonight they plan to lock you into repayment and silence before the bank review hits next week." And the room erupted, loud now, real shouting, because fraud is a different level, and I felt my stomach flip because suddenly everything clicked. The pressure, the urgency, the witnesses, the public shame. They weren't just trying to punish me, they were trying to bury evidence under a signature. And I looked at my father and whispered, "You used my name." And he tried to step toward me. "Nadia, listen." And Victor stepped between us instantly, calm but immovable, and said, "Do not touch her." And my father froze because for the first time he was facing a man who wasn't afraid of him, and my sister Kira's phone shook because she finally understood the story had turned, and she wasn't controlling it anymore. And I looked at her and said, "You streamed this." And she stammered, "I didn't know it would be like this." And I said, "You never know until it's your turn." And then I turned back to the crowd, to the witnesses my parents assembled like weapons, and I said, loud enough for everyone, "You all came to watch me get humiliated. Congratulations, you got your show, but now you're going to watch the truth." And my father shouted, "Nadia," and I ignored him and asked the crowd the question that sets fire to hypocrisy. "If this was your daughter, would you tell her to sign?" And nobody answered, not one person, because suddenly it wasn't fun anymore, and Victor leaned toward Amaka and said, "It's time." And Amaka pulled out her phone and said, "I'm calling the bank's fraud unit, and I'm requesting a police report for coercion and attempted theft." And my mother's face collapsed into panic, and my father started speaking too fast. "We can talk privately." And Victor said, "You had your chance to be private. You chose public." And I stood there with that letter pressed to my chest, car keys in my palm, and my whole life rearranging itself in real time, because the next step wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. It was about what they did with my name, what debts they hid, what else they forged, and I realized the real cliff wasn't whether I'd forgive them, it was whether I was about to discover that my entire adult life had been quietly tied to their financial mess without me knowing. And just as I opened my mouth to ask Amaka what the bank review meant for me, my father blurted out the one sentence that told me there was an even bigger secret still buried. He leaned toward my mother and hissed loud enough that I heard it. if the mortgage file comes out, we're finished. And my blood went cold because mortgage file meant house, property, collateral, and it meant my name was probably on something massive, something that could bury me if I didn't act fast. And Victor looked at me with a steady calm and said, "Nadia, we leave now. And then we start pulling every document with your name on it. Because what they did tonight was cruel, but what they've been doing behind your back might be criminal." And I grabbed my phone. I grabbed my keys. I tucked the letter like it was my heartbeat, and I walked toward the door while 75 people watched my parents unravel, and behind me my mother started crying loud, performative. "Please, Nadia, don't do this." And my father's voice cracked. "You're ruining this family." And I didn't turn back, because the only thing worse than being used is being used again. And as the door swung open and the hallway air hit my face like freedom, I heard Victor say one last thing over the chaos. Quiet but lethal. "You already ruined it, Gerald. She's just refusing to carry the damage for you anymore." We didn't even make it to the parking lot before my phone started vibrating like it was possessed. Dad, Mom, Kira, unknown numbers, and then private messages from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly acting like we were besties. And Victor didn't look surprised at all. He walked with that calm, "I've already thought 5 steps ahead" pace, one hand lightly guiding me by the elbow like he was making sure I didn't get swarmed. And Amaka was already on her phone. Not yelling, not panicking, just speaking in that precise tone that makes grown men suddenly start sweating. "Yes, hello. I need to report suspected identity fraud and coercion connected to a guarantor signature. Yes, I'll hold." And I stood there in the cold night air with my mother's letter pressed to my chest and my keys biting into my palm, and I remember thinking, this is crazy. I'm 30 years old, and I still feel like a kid who's about to be punished for telling the truth. And then I heard the restaurant door slam behind us, and Kira's voice came screeching across the sidewalk. "Nadia, wait, 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 you can't just leave," like she was the victim. And then my father's shoes, heavy, angry, that fast stomp he uses when he wants to make you shrink. And I didn't turn around at first because turning around is how they pull you back into the same old script. But Victor turned, planted his feet, and held up one hand like a stop sign. And my father froze for half a second, like his brain couldn't compute. Someone blocking him, and he spat, "Get out of my way." And Victor said, "Calm. You don't get to chase her after you tried to trap her." And my father snapped, "She is my daughter." And Victor said, "She is your victim." And that word landed like a slap, because it's hard to argue with a word that fits perfectly. And Kira's camera was still rolling, still pointed at my face, and she tried to soften her tone. That fake influencer empathy voice. "Guys, I'm trying to fix this. I'm trying to help." And I finally turned and looked at her, really looked, and she didn't look worried about me. She looked worried about her numbers, and I said, "Turn it off." And she blinked, "But it's live. People are asking questions." And I said, "Good, let them ask, but you don't get to film my nervous system collapsing." And she scoffed, and then she did that thing where she pretends she's reasonable. "Okay, but you're making Dad look bad." And I laughed, one short laugh. "I'm not making him look anything. He's just finally on camera." And my father lunged for Kira's phone like he was going to snatch it, and she jerked back, "Don't touch my phone." And for a split second I saw it, the family eating itself, because when clout meets control, somebody bleeds. And then Mom appeared behind them, hair messy, mascara already starting to run, and she stretched her hands out like she was in a church drama. "Nadia, baby, please." And I felt my chest tighten because that baby wasn't love, it was a hook. And she stepped closer. "We need to talk privately." And I said, "You had private for 30 years, and she flinched like I'd slapped her, and she switched tactics instantly. "You don't understand. Gerald is under pressure." And I stared at her. "He tried to make me sign a debt." And she whispered like she was confessing something holy, "Because we were trying to protect the house." And the way she said protect made my stomach drop. Because people always call it protection when they're protecting themselves. And Amaka's head snapped toward her, and she said, "Ma'am, don't admit anything else on a public sidewalk." And Mom's face twisted. "Who are you?" And Amaka replied, "The person who knows what fraud means without needing Google." And my father hissed, "You're poisoning her against us." And Victor said, "You poisoned her with lies." And then something sharp happened. My father's composure cracked, and he snarled at Victor, "You think you can just show up and take what's mine?" And that sentence made me go cold because it wasn't about love. It was about ownership, and Victor's eyes narrowed. She's not property, and my father stepped closer again. She wouldn't even have a career without my name, and I felt that old familiar shame trying to rise, like my lungs were trained to apologize. But it didn't land, because I could still feel the letter against my heart, and suddenly that shame felt stupid, outdated, like a bad habit, and I said, "You didn't give me my career, you gave me anxiety," and a cousin nearby made a tiny sound like, oh, because people love a comeback when it's not happening to them, and my father's nostrils flared. "Watch your mouth," and I said, "Or what? You'll humiliate me again? You already used my birthday like a courtroom," and Mom started crying louder. "This is a misunderstanding," and I looked at her and said, "A misunderstanding doesn't come with a promissory note and witnesses." And then Kira, because she's incapable of not centering herself, blurted, "Okay, but if Dad goes to jail, what happens to us?" And I turned to her slowly, "Us," and she shrugged, "The family," and I said, "You weren't thinking about family when you were live streaming me like I was a zoo exhibit." And she snapped, "I didn't know it would flip like this," and I said, "You never care until the consequence has your name on it." And then my phone rang again, a known number, and Amaka nodded at it like she already knew, and she said, "Answer on speaker." And I did, and a woman's voice came through, professional, clipped, "This is the bank fraud unit. We need to confirm identity and clarify whether you authorized any guarantor documentation connected to the Patterson property file." And my stomach dropped so hard it felt like falling, and I said, "I didn't authorize anything." And the woman said, "We have a pending review scheduled and an internal alert triggered tonight due to a dispute initiated by your legal representative. We advise you not to sign any documents presented by third parties." And I glanced at my parents, and my father's face had gone gray, because he knew the bank was awake now. And Mom's mouth opened like she was going to speak, and Amaka raised a finger. Like, "Don't." And the bank woman continued, "We will need you to come in tomorrow with government identification and any relevant communications. Do you feel safe at your current location?" And I looked at Victor, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to lie and say yes for someone else's comfort. So I said, "Not if I stay here." And the bank woman said, "Understood. We will note that." And then the call ended, and the silence afterward was loud, and my father tried to salvage it with one last manipulation. He softened his voice. "Nadia, we can fix this. Just come home and we'll talk." And the phrase "come home" almost made me laugh, because home is supposed to be safety, not a trap. And I said, "I'm not coming home to negotiate my own identity." And Mom stepped closer. "Where will you go?" And I said, "Somewhere you can't ambush me with paperwork." And she whispered, desperate now, "But the house." And I cut her off. "The house is not my responsibility." And my father snapped, "You're on the guarantor. You have to help." And Victor's head turned sharply. "So you admit she's on it?" And my father froze, eyes flicking, caught again, and Amaka smiled slightly, the kind of smile that means you just handed her a winning exhibit, and she said, "Thank you, sir. That will be useful." And my father exploded, "You set this up?" And Victor replied, "No, you did. You just expected her to fold." And then Kira's phone chimed, and she looked down and her face strained, and she whispered, "My follower count is dropping." Like that was the tragedy, and someone behind her muttered, "Good." And that tiny moment was a pattern interrupt I didn't expect, because for once, the universe wasn't rewarding the villain, and Kira looked up at me with a shaky voice. "Nadia, please, tell them it's not like that." And I said, "It is exactly like that." And I stepped toward her and lowered my voice so only she could hear. "If you want to fix something for once, leave the video up. Don't delete it. Don't hide. Let people see what you helped do." And her eyes widened because she knew what that meant, accountability, and she backed away like I'd offer her fire. And then my mother did the last thing she had left. She tried to weaponize guilt with religion. "God says honor your parents." And I stared at her and said, "God also says don't lie." And my father shouted, "Enough." And he took one step toward me again. And Victor stepped in front of me like a wall, and he said, "This conversation is over." And my father's voice cracked, "You're stealing my daughter." And Victor replied, "You rented her." And that sentence made my mother make a noise like she'd been hit in the stomach, and I could see it, the truth. Not just that they lied, but that they always believed they were entitled to lie because they thought they were doing something noble. And I suddenly understood something that made my skin crawl. My parents didn't just betray me. They built their identity on controlling me. And that's why tonight felt like a trial, because it was their last attempt to stamp my life with their authority before the documents caught up to them. And I looked at the restaurant windows and saw the reflections of my relatives still hovering inside, still gossiping, still pretending they weren't part of this. And I thought, wow, I used to crave these people's approval like oxygen. And now all I want is distance. And Victor touched my shoulder gently. We're leaving, and I nodded. And as we walked toward his car, Mom followed 2 steps behind like she couldn't help herself. Nadia, please don't do this. And I turned my head just enough to say, you did this. And then Amaka opened the passenger door for me like she was escorting a witness out of a hostile courtroom, and I slid in, still clutching the letter. And Victor got into the driver's seat and didn't start the car immediately. He looked at me and said, I want you to hear me. Clearly, you don't owe them a conversation. You don't owe them a signature. You don't owe them silence. And my throat tightened and I whispered, I don't even know what I owe myself. And he nodded like he understood. You owe yourself the truth, and then you owe yourself protection. And then the car started and the restaurant shrank behind us, and my phone buzzed again and again and again. But the noise felt far away now, like it belonged to a life that wasn't mine anymore, and I stared down at the envelope, at Catherine's handwriting, and I realized the biggest revenge wasn't exposing them. It was exiting their control with my dignity intact. But then my phone lit up with a new message from an unknown number that made my blood freeze, because it wasn't a call, it was a photo. A blurry picture of a mortgage document with my name circled in red, and underneath it, one line, if you don't come back tonight, we'll make sure you carry this debt alone. And Victor glanced at my face and immediately knew something shifted, and he said, what did they send? And my mouth went dry as I handed him the phone, because the threat wasn't emotional anymore. It was financial warfare. And I realized the next move wasn't going to be another argument in a restaurant. It was going to be a full-scale fight over my identity, my credit, my future, and the question wasn't whether my parents were capable of betrayal. The question was how deep they'd buried their fingerprints in my life, and how far they'd go now that the truth had a witness list and a paper trail. Victor didn't even need to read the whole message twice. He glanced once, jaw tightening, and then he took the next exit like his brain had already mapped 3 safe routes and 2 legal routes. And I sat there staring at that circled mortgage document like it was a snake in my lap, because it wasn't just a threat. It was proof that my parents had been doing paperwork behind my back while smiling in my face. And that kind of betrayal feels different. It doesn't sting. It infects. It makes you question every signature you ever wrote, every just sign here moment you ever trusted. And Amaka leaned forward from the back seat and said, okay, breathe. Tell me exactly what you've signed in the last 5 years. And I tried to think, and my mind kept skipping like a scratch CD, because under stress your brain stops being a library and becomes a burning building. And I said, I co-signed something years ago. They said it was to help refinance. They said it would lower the payment. They said it was temporary. And Victor muttered, temporary is the favorite word of people who plan to make you permanent. And I almost laughed, but it came out like a cough, and I said, I didn't even get a copy. And Amaka didn't react like it was shocking. She reacted like it was predictable. She said, of course you didn't, because they didn't want you to read it in peace. They wanted you to sign it in emotion. And that sentence hit so hard my throat tightened, because that's exactly what they did at the restaurant too. Pressure, eyes, witnesses, noise, urgency, and then the car went quiet for a second, and I felt my heartbeat in my ears, and my phone buzzed again. And this time it was my mother's voicemail popping up, one after another, like machine gun taps, and then a message from Kira, please answer, Dad is losing it. And I stared at it thinking, girl, you watched him lose it in HD, and you still want me to manage his feelings. And then my father's number called again, and I didn't pick up, and immediately another unknown number called, and Amaka said, don't answer unknown numbers right now. And Victor said, we need to get you somewhere safe and quiet where you can think. And I said, my apartment. And Victor said, not yet. And I started to protest, but he cut me off gently. If they have documents and they're already circling your name, they might have access to addresses too. We don't do predictable tonight. And that's when it hit me that this wasn't just a family fight. This was an extraction, like pulling someone out of a house fire. And Victor drove to a hotel on the other side of town, not fancy, just clean, anonymous. The kind of place where no one asks questions, and I kept thinking about the restaurant, the faces, the silence, the way people watched like it was entertainment, and I hated how familiar that felt, because my whole childhood was me being watched for mistakes and judged for not being grateful enough. And then Victor parked under a light, killed the engine, and turned to me and said, "Before we go inside, I need you to hear this. Their next move will be to make you panic and rush. Your next move is to slow down." And I nodded, and my hands were still shaking, and I said, "I feel like I'm about to throw up." And Amaka said, "That's your body realizing it's not safe around them." And I swallowed and said, "But they're my parents." And Amaka's face softened just a fraction. "Exactly. That's why it hurts this much." And we went inside, and the lobby smelled like lemon cleaner and stale carpet, and the clerk didn't care who we were, and Victor paid for the room without me arguing because my pride was exhausted, and when the door shut behind us and the lock clicked, I finally exhaled like I'd been holding my breath since childhood, and then my phone buzzed again. A text from my father this time, not a call, a text which meant he wanted a record. "If you don't come home tonight, I will contact your employer and explain your instability and your threats." And I stared at the word instability and felt rage rise because that's the oldest trick, make the truth teller sound crazy, and I heard my own voice in my head from years ago. Maybe I'm overreacting, and I realized how deep their programming went. And then Amaka held out her hand. "Give me your phone for 2 minutes." And I did, and she took screenshots of everything, every message, every circled document, every threat, and she emailed them to herself and to Victor. And then she handed it back and said, "Good. Now if anyone tries to rewrite the story, we have receipts." And I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ugly hotel painting on the wall, and Victor opened his laptop like he'd done this before, and Amaka pulled out a slim folder I hadn't noticed and slid it onto the table. And my stomach dropped again because the folder looked like the kind of thing that changes lives, and I said, "What is that?" And Victor said, "The parts they didn't want you to see." And he flipped it open, and inside were copies of transfers, legal notices, and a document titled Disclosure Requirement with my father's name typed in clean black letters, and my chest tightened and I whispered, "So they knew this was coming," and Amaka nodded. "For months." And I felt something almost like grief, not for the lie itself, but for the time. All that time I wasted trying to earn love from people who were scheduling my humiliation like an event. And Victor said, "They didn't just plan a party, they planned a narrative." And I said, "Why?" And Victor didn't answer immediately. He just looked at the papers like he was measuring the size of the rod. And then he said, "Because control is their currency and you were their easiest account." And I swallowed hard. "So what do I do?" And Amaka sat down across from me and said, "Tonight, you do 3 things. You stop talking to them directly, you stop signing anything, and you stop moving alone." And I nodded, and she continued, "Then tomorrow, we lock your credit. We pull a full credit report. We request every mortgage document with your name on it, and we start a paper trail that makes it expensive to lie." And I blinked. "Lock my credit?" And she said, "Yes, because if they're this bold, they might try to open something in your name out of spite or desperation." And I felt my skin go cold again, because I'd never imagined my parents as people who would commit identity fraud. But then I remembered the restaurant and realized I'd never imagined them as people who would do any of that either, and my phone lit up with another message from Kira. "Mom is crying. Dad says you're ungrateful. Please just come back and apologize so we can end this." And I laughed, and it wasn't funny. It was bitter, and I said out loud, "Apologize for what? For existing?" And Victor said quietly, "That's the point. They want you back in the role." And I stared at the wall, and something in me snapped into clarity. Because my whole life I'd been the fixer, the calmer, the peacekeeper, and peacekeeping is just another word for self-abandonment when you're the only one sacrificing. And I said, "I'm done fixing." And Amaka nodded like she'd been waiting for me to say it, and she said, "Good, because now we fight smart." And then Victor's laptop chimed, and he turned the screen toward me, and I saw a property record search with my parents' address and several liens and a recent application entry flagged as pending review, and my mouth went dry, and Victor said, "That threat they sent you, it's not just a scare tactic. They were trying to push something through tonight." And I felt my heart slam. "What does that mean?" And Amaka leaned in, eyes sharp. "It means your father was trying to get ahead of a deadline." And I said, "A deadline for what?" And Victor said, "For the bank's verification." And I stared at the screen and whispered, "So the restaurant wasn't about money for me. It was about making me sign something before the bank caught them." And Amaka said, "Exactly. And when you walked out, their backup plan became intimidation." And my hands started shaking again, not from fear this time, from anger, because they didn't just humiliate me. They tried to trap me into a debt under pressure while recording it. And I said, "How many times have I signed something for them?" And my voice cracked. "How many times have they used me?" And Victor didn't sugarcoat it. He said, "More than you remember." And then my phone buzzed with a final message that made everything go still. It was from my mother, a photo of my childhood bedroom, my old photo frames, my school trophies, my nursing graduation picture, and underneath it she wrote, "If you don't come back, we'll put everything you own outside and tell everyone you abandoned us." And I stared at it, and I felt the old panic rise, the fear of being painted as the villain. And then I realized something that steadied me. They were still trying to control the story, not the truth. And I looked at Victor and Amaka and said, "What if they go to my job tomorrow?" And Amaka said, "Let them." And I blinked and she continued, "Because intimidation only works when you're isolated. Tomorrow you won't be." And Victor added, "And if he contacts your employer with threats or lies, that becomes another piece of evidence." And I swallowed and nodded, and I didn't feel brave, but I felt clear. And then Victor's phone rang, and he looked at the caller ID and his expression tightened, and he put it on speaker without asking, and a man's voice came through, older, controlled, furious underneath. "Victor, this is Gerald Patterson. You need to stop interfering. You're manipulating my daughter." And Victor replied calmly, "You tried to force her into a signature under coercion." And my father snapped, "She owes this family." And Amaka leaned toward the phone and said, "Sir, we're recording this call." And there was a pause, and then my father's voice dropped slicker. "Fine. Then record this, Nadia. If you don't come back tonight and sign what you were supposed to sign, I will make sure you regret it. I will make sure you lose your job, and I will make sure you carry this house on your back like you carried everything else." And my stomach flipped, and Victor said, "Thank you, Gerald." And my father hissed, "For what?" And Victor said, "For confirming the coercion in your own words." And the line went dead, and in that silence I realized the game had changed, because my father thought he was threatening me into submission, but he just handed us the kind of audio that makes banks and employers stop taking his calls. And Amaka looked at me and said, "Now you see it. They don't have power. They have noise." And I nodded slowly, and I stared at Catherine's letter again, and for the first time I didn't just feel found, I felt armed. And I thought, okay, if they want war, they picked the wrong day, because tomorrow we weren't just pulling documents, we were pulling the truth out of every drawer, every file, every signature they ever tried to hide. And somewhere deep in my chest I felt the beginning of something dangerous and clean, not revenge, not rage, but resolve. And I whispered, "What's the first thing we do in the morning?" And Amaka smiled, sharp and calm. "We check your credit, and then we check their lies, and then we decide which one hurts them more." Morning hit like a courtroom light, harsh and unforgiving. And the first thing I did was sit up in that stiff hotel bed and realize I'd slept with my phone in my hand like a weapon. And then I remembered my father's voice from the call, the way he said, "Carry this house on your back." And my stomach clenched, because he didn't mean it emotionally. He meant it legally. And Victor was already awake at the little desk, laptop open, tie on, looking like a man who'd chosen violence, but the professional kind. And Amaka was on the other bed tying her hair back like she was about to scrub in for surgery, and she looked at me and said, "No messages, no calls, no emotional decisions until we see facts." And I nodded, but my hand still went straight to my notifications, because trauma trains you to monitor danger. And there were 12 voicemails from my mother, and 5 from Kira, and 1 from an unknown number that left a 3-second silent message that felt like a threat all by itself. And I said, "I hate how they can still make my body panic." And Victor didn't even look up. He said, "That's not magic, that's conditioning." And Amaka slid my phone toward me and said, "Open your credit app." And my heart started beating faster, as if I was about to see a death certificate. And I pulled my credit file, and there it was, a fresh inquiry I didn't recognize from a lender I'd never used. Time stamped late last night, and my mouth went dry. "That's not me." And Amaka's face stayed calm. "We know, but we need to document it." And Victor said, "Screenshot everything." And I did, my fingers shaking on the buttons, and Amaka said, "Now lock your credit." And I went through each bureau like it was a ritual. Freeze, confirm, save pin, freeze, confirm, save pin. And with every click I felt the tiniest bit of my power return, like closing windows in a storm. And then Victor turned his laptop toward me and said, "This is the mortgage servicer's contact portal. You're going to request the full loan packet and any modification or refinance documents tied to your name." And I swallowed. "What if they ignore me?" And he said, "They won't, because your name is liability." And that sentence made my skin prickle because he was right. Banks don't care about family feelings, they care about risk. And I wrote the message with my hands still trembling. "I am requesting complete copies of any loan, refinance, modification, assumption, or guarantor documents associated with my name and SSN, including timestamps, signatory verification, and notarization records." And Victor nodded like he approved the tone, and then Amaka said, "Next, we pull property records for the last 10 years, and we check if your signature appears anywhere else." And I stared at her. "How do we do that?" And she said, "Carefully and then with professionals." And she wasn't wrong, but the itch in me needed action. So we started with what we could see: recorded deeds, liens, filings, anything public. And Victor navigated like he'd done this 100 times. And within minutes, he found a home equity line entry from 2 years ago with my name typed as a co-obligor, and my chest tightened so hard it hurt. I never signed for a HELOC, and Victor said, "Either you did and they lied about what it was, or you didn't, and we're dealing with forged signatures." And Amaka leaned in and said, "Either way, this is not a family argument anymore. This is financial abuse." And hearing those words out loud made me feel both sick and weirdly relieved, because if you labeled a monster, it stops being fog. And then my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from my mother that looked sweet on the surface. "Come home. We can talk like adults. You're scaring your father." And I laughed, short and sharp, because nothing says adult conversation like ambush contracts and public humiliation. And Victor said, "Don't respond." And I didn't, but it kept coming. And then Kira sent, "Dad says if you don't cooperate, he'll tell everyone you were never really ours anyway." And I froze, because that was the same poison they used on Summer in the restaurant. Strip your identity, then sell your dignity back to you at a price. And I whispered, "They're going to try to rewrite my whole life." And Amaka said, "Let them, because lies multiply when they're cornered." And then she looked straight at me and said, "Where are you watching from? By the way, I want you to tell me out loud right now, city and time, because I need you anchored in the present, not trapped in their story." And it felt random, but it worked, like a pattern interrupt, like someone clapping in your face while you're dissociating. And I blinked and said, "I'm in Lagos. It's 9:12 a.m. And Amaka nodded. "Good, Lagos, 9:12. You're here, you're safe, now we move." And Victor stood up, snapped his laptop shut, and said, "We're going to your workplace first." And I flinched. Why would we go there? That's exactly where he threatened. And Victor said, "Because you don't let him arrive first and control the narrative. You go in calm, documented, prepared, and you make it clear you're being harassed." And my throat tightened. "They'll think I'm drama." And Amaka cut in. "No, they'll think you're an adult protecting your identity, and if anyone tries to spin it, you're going to sound like the only sane person in the room." And I wanted to believe her, but my stomach still felt like a fist. And on the drive over, I stared out the window, watching normal people buy bread and fuel and live normal lives. And I kept thinking how unfair it is that betrayal doesn't pause the world. It just pauses you. And then Victor pulled into the parking lot near my hospital, and my hands started sweating because this place is my identity, my safety, my proof that I built something, and my father knew that. That's why he threatened it. And Amaka squeezed my shoulder once. "Head up," and we walked in, and the smell of disinfectant hit me like routine, like home, and I started to breathe easier until I saw it. My father's car across the street at the curb, like a predator that had found my watering hole, and my blood went cold. And Victor followed my gaze and said quietly, "Okay, he's here." And Amaka's voice stayed steady. "Good. Now we control the order of events." And we walked straight to administration, and my manager's assistant looked up, surprised to see me not in uniform, and I said, "I need 10 minutes with HR and security. It's urgent." And she opened her mouth to ask questions, and I cut it off with truth. I'm being threatened and my identity may be compromised. And those words changed her whole face, because workplaces don't want lawsuits, and suddenly doors opened fast. And I was in an HR office with a box of tissues on the table and a woman who spoke softly, like I was fragile. And I almost hated that softness because I wasn't fragile. I was furious. But I kept my voice calm and clinical, the way I talk to families during code blues. My father is outside. He has threatened to contact the hospital with false claims about my character. He has threatened my employment. I have documented texts and a recorded phone call with explicit coercion, and there may be fraudulent lending inquiries against my name. And I slid my phone across the desk, and HR watched a snippet, and her expression tightened, not at me, at him. And she said, "Do you feel unsafe?" And I answered honestly, yes. And then security was called, and while they took my statement, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was my father texting, "I can see you inside, don't make this ugly," and my stomach twisted, because of course he wanted me to feel watched. And then the security supervisor came back and said, "Ma'am, we can escort him off property if he approaches, and we're logging his plate." And the relief that hit me was embarrassing. Like I'd been holding a heavy box alone, and someone finally took one corner, and Victor leaned toward me and said, "Now, you see, when you move first, his threats shrink." And then HR added, "If he emails us or calls, we will route it through legal. You're not in trouble." And I felt my eyes sting because I'd been bracing for the opposite, and I whispered, "Thank you." And we left the office, and as we walked toward the main corridor, my father appeared at the front entrance, not inside yet, hovering just outside the doors with that stiff posture he uses when he's trying to look respectable. And he saw me and lifted his hand like he was waving to a neighbor, like we were fine, like he hadn't tried to trap me in debt. And then he mouthed something I couldn't hear, but I could read his lips. "Come here." And my whole body wanted to obey out of habit, that old programming. And then Amaka stepped half a pace in front of me and said under her breath, "Don't feed the illusion." And I stopped walking right there. And I raised my phone and took a clear photo of him and his car and the timestamp on the entrance clock behind him, and his face changed because he realized I wasn't scared anymore. I was documenting. And that's when he did something I didn't expect. He smiled wider, like a man about to perform, and he pulled out his own phone and started recording me through the glass. And I felt my stomach drop because now he wanted to bait me into reacting so he could post it, twist it, make me look unstable. And then the security supervisor walked up behind me and said, "Sir, you need to step away from the entrance." And my father's smile flickered, just a fraction, and he took one step back, still filming, still smiling, and he shouted through the glass loud enough for people to turn. "Tell them the truth. Tell them you're abandoning your family." And heads turned, eyes widened, the old shame tried to rise, and I felt my pulse spike. And then I did the one thing he couldn't edit into a villain clip. I calmly turned to the nearest staff who'd paused, and I said, "I'm safe. I'm being harassed. Security is handling it." And I kept walking, no yelling, no tears, no scene. And behind me I heard the security supervisor say, "Sir, leave now." And my father's voice rose, angry and desperate. And I didn't look back because I already knew the next move he would make if intimidation failed. He would escalate to paperwork, to banks, to relatives, to a new story where he's the victim and I'm the monster. And Victor leaned in as we reached the parking lot and said, "We just forced him to switch strategies." And Amaka said, "And the next strategy is where the real evidence shows up." And my phone buzzed again, and it wasn't my mother this time. It was a notification from the mortgage portal. "Document upload available." And my chest tightened as I opened it, and on the screen was a scanned signature page with my name on it. And the signature looked like mine at first glance, but the strokes were wrong. Too smooth, like someone copying me. And at the bottom was a notary stamp from a date I remember vividly because it was the week I was on night shifts and never left the hospital. And I whispered, "That's not possible." And Victor said, "It is if someone pretended to be you." And Amaka said, "Or if someone used you when you were too tired to notice what you were signing." And the worst part was I couldn't tell which option was scarier. And then a new message came in from an unknown number with one line that made my skin go cold. "If you report fraud, we'll show everyone what you did the night you signed." My whole body went ice cold reading that text because it wasn't just a threat. It was a message wrapped in certainty. Like whoever sent it knew there was a moment in my past they could weaponize. And then Victor said, "Don't answer that." And Amaka said, "Screenshot it and forward it to yourself right now in case your phone mysteriously gets wiped." And I did it so fast my fingers fumbled. And then I looked up and said the quiet part out loud. "They're implying I signed something." And Victor nodded. "Or they want you to believe you did so you'll panic and comply." And we stood there in the heat of the parking lot like three people watching a storm line roll in. And my mind started flipping through memories like a desperate librarian. Nights, shifts, birthdays. That one week, I was so exhausted I fell asleep in my car for 20 minutes. That one time my dad asked me to just sign something for the house. And I did it standing in the kitchen, half listening, pen in hand, thinking it was a delivery form or a utilities thing. And then my stomach dropped so hard it felt like falling downstairs, because I remembered the exact detail I'd tried to forget. My father had placed the paper on top of a stack, like a magician controlling what you see, and he'd kept talking over me while I signed, and then he'd said, "Good girl," like I was 8, and I'd felt disgusted but too tired to fight, and I whispered, "Oh my God," and Amaka's eyes sharpened. "You remember something?" And I nodded slowly. I remember signing one page. I didn't read it. I was rushing to work. He was blocking the doorway, and he said it was urgent. And Victor exhaled like a man seeing the shape of a case form in his head. That's how they do it. They don't beat you, they hurry you. And my mouth went dry because that's exactly what it was. Hurry as a weapon, urgency as a leash. And then my phone rang again. Unknown number, and Victor said, "Let it go to voicemail." And it did, and the voicemail came through as a transcript, one sentence. "If you want your name cleared, meet us tonight and bring your ID." And I laughed once, a sharp sound that didn't match the panic in my chest. "Bring my ID so they can copy it." And Amaka said, "Exactly, do you see how it's all the same trick?" And I stared at the mortgage document again, the notary stamp, the date, and that date was the week my father insisted we do a family dinner at his friend's house. And I remember because I showed up late in scrubs and everyone looked at me like I'd insulted royalty, and my father pulled me aside and said, "Don't embarrass me." And now my brain connected it like a wire sparking, because his friend's wife had been introducing herself as a notary at the dinner like it was a personality. Oh, I notarize things. I'm always signing documents. And I thought it was small talk, but it wasn't small talk. It was a breadcrumb. It was the setup, and my throat tightened. The notary. I whispered, "I think I met her." And Victor's voice dropped. "Names, I need names." And I said, "I can't remember her last name, but her first name was Diane. She had this bright coral lipstick and she laughed too loud, and she kept touching my arm when she talked." And Amaka snapped her fingers once. "Good. Sensory details, we can find her." And for a second my anger burned hotter than my fear, because what kind of father sets up a notary dinner like a trap and then plays innocent later? And I heard his voice in my head again. Lady of the house, like he was crowning Kira while dethroning me, and the humiliation came back. But it came back different now, not as shame, as fuel, and Victor said, "We're not going to their meeting, we're going to ours." And I followed them back to the car, and as soon as we were inside, Victor called someone and put it on speaker. "Good afternoon. This is Victor Adeyemi. I'm calling regarding suspected identity fraud and forged lending documentation tied to a mortgage. I need an appointment today." And the person on the phone started with the usual slow script, and Victor cut through it with calm authority. "This is time sensitive. There are active coercion attempts, and there are public harassment elements. I am prepared to provide evidence." And suddenly the script voice turned human. "Okay, I can fit you in at 3:30. And Amaka looked at me. "Now you're going to do something hard." And I swallowed. "What?" And she said, "You're going to call the one person in that family who still has a conscience." And I already knew who she meant, my aunt, the one who always looked uncomfortable when my father spoke, the one who once slipped me cash and whispered, "Don't let him trap you." And I hadn't called her in years because it felt disloyal, because family loyalty is the cult rule, and I used to follow rules, and now I was done, so I called, and she answered on the second ring like she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. "Hello," and I said, "Auntie, it's me." And there was a pause, and then her voice went soft. "My baby." And that nearly cracked me because no one in that house called me that unless they wanted something, and I said, "I need the truth." "Did I sign anything for the house?" And she inhaled sharply like I'd punched her, and then she whispered, "He made you sign." And my stomach flipped. "What did he make me sign?" And she said, "I don't know the exact document, but I saw papers and I saw Diane and..." I heard him tell her, "She won't ask questions," and my whole body went hot with rage, and I said, "You knew?" And she started crying quietly. "I tried to talk to your mother. She told me to mind my business. She said you were being difficult, and this was the only way to keep the house." And I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, and I forced my voice steady. "What else?" And she hesitated, and Victor mouthed, "Keep going," and I said, "Auntie, please." And she exhaled, like surrender. "Your father has been behind on payments before, multiple times. He hid letters, he hid calls. He started borrowing against the house. And then when Kira came, he started acting like a king again, but it was fake. It was all borrowed." And my throat tightened. So this lady of the house thing was a performance. And my aunt laughed bitterly through tears. "Everything with your father is performance." And then she dropped the sentence that made the unknown text message suddenly make sense. "He has a video," and my skin went cold. "What video?" And she whispered, "The night you signed. He told your mother to record you agreeing so you couldn't deny it later." And my chest seized, because of course he did. Because controlling people don't just steal your money, they steal your future arguments. And I asked, "Agreeing to what?" And she said, "He asked you questions like, 'You want to help family, right?' And you nodded. You were tired. You were half-dressed for work. You weren't reading anything. You were just trying to leave." And I felt sick, because that's the kind of trick that looks like consent if you cut it right. And then my aunt said, "He kept saying, 'Say it clearly.' And you said, 'Yes, I'll help.'" And then he smiled like he'd won. And Victor leaned closer to the phone and asked calmly, "Ma'am, do you know where that video is stored?" And my aunt sniffed and said, "He keeps backups on a hard drive in his office. And he has a cloud folder he calls property." And Amaka closed her eyes like she was praying for my restraint, and I said, "So that's what you did the night you signed. They're going to play a manipulated clip and say I consented." And my aunt whispered, "Yes." And then she said something that made me pause. "And baby, there's something else. There's paperwork about you being responsible even if he dies." And my blood ran cold, because this wasn't just a mortgage. This was a trap designed to outlive him. And I said, "Annie, do you have anything, any proof?" And she went quiet, and then she said, "I have one thing, a photo I took because I was scared. It shows your name on a page and Diane's stamp." And my heart pounded. "Send it." And she said, "I will, but you have to be careful. Your father checks my phone sometimes." And I almost couldn't believe the audacity of a grown man policing another grown woman like property. But then again, that's his whole worldview, and I said, "Delete the sent message after. Send it to Victor's number, not mine." And Victor nodded and gave it, and my aunt whispered, "I'm sorry," and I didn't soften it. I told her the truth. "I'm sorry too, but I'm not losing my life to keep his secrets." And then I hung up and stared out the windshield, and for a second everything went quiet inside me. Like the moment after a code blue when you finally hear your own breathing. And Amaka said, "Here's the question I want you to sit with, and I want you to answer me honestly. If this happened to you, would you forgive them if they said, 'We didn't mean it'? Or would you cut them off forever?" And I didn't answer right away because the answer was changing as I spoke, and my phone buzzed again, and it was a message from my mother. "Your father is sick, you're killing him." And my lips curled because guilt is their favorite currency. And then Victor's phone pinged with an incoming image, and he turned it to us, and there it was, a blurry but clear enough photo of a signature page with my printed name beside a line, Diane's stamp at the bottom, and a checkbox marked guarantor. And under the stamp, a handwritten note in the margin that made my stomach lurch, "Make sure daughter signs before December." And I stared at it and whispered, "They planned this." And then my phone lit up with a new call, and this time the caller ID wasn't unknown. It was Kira, and something in me smiled without humor, because I knew exactly what she was about to say, and I knew whatever she said next was going to decide whether this ends politely or whether it ends with a full public collapse. Kira's name on my screen felt like a slap with a manicure, and I stared at it for half a second too long because my brain was doing that thing where it tries to predict the next punch so you can brace. And Victor said, "Don't answer on speaker yet." And Amaka said, "Record it." And I hit record with my thumb like my life depended on it, because it did, and then I answered, "Hello," and Kira didn't even pretend to be polite. She came in sweet like poison. "Hi, love, it's Kira." And I said nothing, because the way she said love made my skin crawl, and then she sighed like I was the difficult one. "I'm trying to help you, okay, because your dad is really stressed and he's not sleeping," and Victor mouthed, "Manipulation," and I could almost hear the script in her head, the one where she's the calm queen cleaning up the mess of the angry daughter. And then Kira said, "You're spiraling over paperwork you don't understand." And I actually laughed, a single sharp sound, because that was bold. Telling me I don't understand paperwork when my name is on a guarantor line, and I said, "What do you want?" And she paused like she didn't like my tone, and then she said, "We can make this easy. You just need to come tonight, bring your ID, and sign a quick correction so your dad can refinance and you'll be released." And I looked at Victor because it was almost funny how perfectly that matched the voicemail. And Victor's eyes said, "See?" And I kept my voice level. "Why would I bring my ID if you already have my signature?" And Kira's sweetness tightened, "Because banks require verification." And I said, "No, they require verification for the person applying, not the person you're trying to trap." And there was a tiny silence, the kind that tells you hit something real. And then she recovered fast. "Listen, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to protect our home." And I said, "Your home?" And she answered without missing a beat, "Yes, our home." And it was wild how confidently she said our, like she didn't meet this house 2 seconds ago. Like, she didn't just arrive and start rearranging everyone's life like furniture. And she continued, "And I'll be honest, if you don't cooperate, your dad will have no choice but to go legal." And I said, "Go legal with what?" "The forged notary stamp and the coerced signature." And her breath caught, just slightly, like her body reacted before her mouth could lie. And then she snapped, "Don't accuse people of crimes you can't prove." And I said, "I can prove you're trying to coerce me right now on a recorded call." And Kira went quiet again, and then she shifted tactics because that's what people like her do. They treat truth like a room they can redecorate. "Okay," she said softly, "let's talk woman to woman." And I knew exactly where this was going. The fake sisterhood card, the "I'm trying to help you" card, the "don't make me be the bad guy" card. And then she said, "You don't want to ruin your father's reputation. He's respected. People look up to him." And I said, "Then he should have respected me enough not to set a notary trap at dinner." And that's when her voice went cold, not angry, not loud, cold like a door locking. "You keep saying trap like you're some victim, but you've been living off him your whole life." And I blinked because there it was, the real Kira, the one who'd been listening to my father's bedtime stories about how everyone else is the problem. And I said, "Name one thing I've lived off him for." And Kira didn't answer directly. She did that thing where people dodge because details are dangerous. "You got opportunities," she said, "and you know it." And I said, "So you're repeating his narrative now?" And she snapped, "I'm repeating facts." And I said, "Okay, facts. Did you tell my father to text me? We have proof of what you did the night you signed." And she went quiet, and then she said, "He's upset." Like that excused everything. And Victor leaned closer and said quietly, "Ask about the video." And I felt my stomach knot, but I did it anyway. "Does he still have the video of me agreeing?" And Kira's voice lifted in fake confusion. "What video?" And I said, "The one where he rushed me out the door and your notary friend stamped a guarantor page." And that's when Kira's composure cracked just enough to show the metal underneath. "You need to stop saying notary friend like it's some conspiracy." And I said, "It's not like a conspiracy, it's coercion." And she hissed, "Fine, if you want to play hard, we can play hard." And then she dropped it, not a threat exactly, more like a promise dressed as advice. "You should check your job contract, sweetheart. Some employers don't like employees with legal disputes." And Victor's head snapped up because that was the first time she'd said the quiet part out loud, career sabotage, and I felt a surge of heat in my chest, and I said, "Are you threatening my job?" And Kira's tone went syrupy again. "No, I'm warning you because I care." And I said, "You care about the house, not me." And she laughed, a small amused laugh. "You're emotional." And I said, "No, I'm awake." And there was another beat. And then she tried the last move, the humiliating move, the one designed to provoke me into saying something messy so they can clip it. "Your dad said you've always been jealous of younger women," she said. And I didn't believe him, but wow. And Amaka's hand flew to her mouth like she couldn't believe the audacity, and I almost fell for it because it was so insulting it felt personal. But then I remembered what Victor said. They don't beat you. They hurry you and they bait you. And I kept my voice calm. Tell him I'm not coming tonight. And Kira's sweetness disappeared completely. Then don't cry when this goes public. And I said, I'm not scared of public. I'm scared of people like you who hide behind it. And I ended the call, and my hands were shaking, not fear shaking, adrenaline shaking, like my body wanted to sprint, but there was nowhere to run except forward, and Amaka said, that call was a gold mine. And Victor nodded. Threats, coercion, intimidation, all on tape. And then my phone buzzed again, and it was my mother this time, but she didn't call, she sent a voice note, and I hate voice notes because they're always used to say things people don't want in writing, and I played it with the volume low, and my mother's voice came through soft and trembling. Please stop this, your father is pacing, he's sweating, he's saying you want him dead. Why are you doing this to us? And if you've ever had a parent weaponize their own health to control you, you know the exact chokehold that sentence is supposed to put on your lungs, and for 1 weak second, it worked. I felt guilt try to crawl up my throat like vomit, and then my brain snapped back to the photo on Victor's phone, the guarantor checkbox, the margin note, the plan, and I realized something that changed everything. My mother wasn't begging me to stop because she loved me. She was begging me to stop because she was scared, not scared for my dad, scared for herself. Scared of what happens when the person who used to carry the weight finally drops it, and I looked at Amaka and said, she's not a victim, she's a partner. And Amaka nodded slowly. Enablers always cry when consequences arrive. It's their favorite costume. And Victor said, we're going to that appointment at 3:30, and then we decide our next move based on what the evidence supports. And we drove in silence for a bit. The kind of silence where each streetlight feels like a checkpoint, and while Victor drove, Amaka opened my notes app and started listing every single detail, like we were building a case file for my own life. The date of the dinner, the name Diane, the coral lipstick, the phrase property folder, the margin note, the text, the voicemail, the job threat, and then she said, now I need you to remember something else, the tiny things, and I closed my eyes and forced myself back to that night I signed. The smell of fried onions in my dad's kitchen, the way the TV was on too loud, the way he stood too close like a wall, the pen he handed me that had a bank logo on it, the way he kept his finger on the line where I needed to sign, sliding it down like I was a child learning to write, and then he'd said, it's just a formality, and my mother had hovered behind him, not speaking, just watching, and I remembered the sound of my own keys jingling because I kept shifting my purse from one shoulder to the other, trying to leave. And I remember my dad's smile when the pen lifted off the paper, a satisfied smile, the kind you see on people who just won something they didn't earn, and I opened my eyes and said, he enjoyed it, and Victor said, control is his addiction. And then we pulled up to the office building where the appointment was, plain glass, beige walls, the kind of place where life-altering decisions get made under fluorescent lights, and in the waiting room the air smelled like printer ink and stale coffee, and I sat there watching a fish tank bubble like it was mocking me, like even the fish had peace, and I didn't. And when the advisor called us in, she was calm, professional, mid-40s, hair pulled back, and she didn't look surprised by anything because she'd probably seen every kind of family money war, and Victor laid out the situation like a surgeon, concise, clean, no emotion. And then he slid the photo across the desk, and the advisor's face changed in a way that made my stomach drop. Not shocked, not confused, concerned, and she said, this appears to be a personal guarantee attached to a mortgage. Refinance package, and my mouth went dry, and I said, can you tell if it's enforceable? And she looked at me and said carefully, enforceability depends on how it was executed, whether you received independent counsel, whether there was misrepresentation, and whether the notarization was valid. And then she asked the question that made my heart slam. Do you have the original documents? And I said, no. And she nodded like she expected that. Then step 1 is a document request. And Victor said, we can do that today. And she said, yes, and you should also place a fraud alert with the credit bureaus and freeze your credit. And as she spoke, I felt that weird mix of terror and relief. Terror because it was real, relief because I wasn't crazy. And then she said something that made Amaka sit up straight. If someone is pressuring you to come sign additional documents, do not go. And I said, they are And she nodded. That's consistent with attempts to cure defects in documentation. And Victor's eyes narrowed because now we had something solid, a reason they were rushing me, and the advisor continued. If the lender's file has missing disclosures or questionable notarization, they may try to get you to re-sign under correction language. And my stomach turned because Kira's exact words came back. Sign a quick correction so you'll be released, and it hit me like a slap. They were trying to use my hope as bait, and I whispered, so it's a trap. And the advisor didn't sugarcoat it. It can be. And then Victor asked, if she is a guarantor, what is her exposure? And the advisor looked at me and said, potentially significant. And that word significant landed like a stone in my chest. And Amaka leaned toward me and whispered, breathe. And I did, slow, controlled, because panic is what they want. And then the advisor printed a checklist and slid it to us. And on that checklist was the exact roadmap to pull the thread until the whole sweater comes apart. Document request, fraud alert, credit freeze, written communication only, no in-person signing, and legal counsel. And as we stood to leave, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from my father, one line. If you don't come tonight, I will show them who you really are. And my body went cold, and Victor said, that's intimidation. And I said, no, staring at the screen. That's a man who thinks my identity belongs to him. And then Amaka asked softly, do you want to go nuclear? And I looked at her, and then I looked at Victor, and for the first time all day I felt something that wasn't fear, it was clarity, and I said, I want to go surgical. And Victor nodded like he'd been waiting for that answer. Good, he said, because the next step isn't to argue with them, it's to corner them with paperwork. And as we walked out into the bright afternoon, I realized tonight wasn't about whether I show up to their little meeting. Tonight was about whether I finally stopped playing defense, and the worst part is the moment I decided that, my phone lit up with an incoming video message from Brianna, my little cousin who lives for drama, and the preview frame showed my father sitting at his dining table with the same bank logo pen, smiling into the camera like he was about to tell a story, and the caption Brianna typed was, he's about to post this, you better hurry. And I swear my heart didn't beat for a full second because I knew exactly what that meant. He wasn't just threatening court, he was threatening character assassination, public humiliation, the kind that sticks to you even when it's a lie. And I looked at Victor and said, he's about to drop the video, and Victor's jaw tightened. Then we move now, and Amaka grabbed my wrist lightly and said, before he controls the narrative, and I want you to tell me something. If your own father was about to publicly expose you with a chopped-up clip to force you back into a financial trap, would you stay quiet and try to be the bigger person? Or would you expose everything first and let the whole world watch the mask fall? Because that's exactly the choice I had in that moment, and the next thing I did would decide whether I walked into their courtroom again, or whether I flipped the entire table on them in front of everybody. I didn't even answer Brianna's message at first because the preview frame alone told me everything. My father had set up his little I'm the calm victim performance, the same dining table he used for every family announcement, the same angle that made him look taller and wiser, the same soft lamp lighting like a pastor about to preach, and I could already imagine the caption he'd slap on it. Something like, my daughter is trying to destroy our family because people like my father don't want truth, they want sympathy, and the easiest way to get sympathy is to make you look unstable. And then Victor said, we don't race his smear campaign with panic, we beat it with receipts. And Amaka said, but we also don't let him drop that first. And I felt the split-second tug of fear again, because if he posted first, half the internet would decide I'm a monster before they even see context. And then I remembered something I learned in ICU that applies to families too, the first story people. Here becomes the baseline. And after that, you're always explaining, always defending, always trying to catch up to a narrative you didn't create. And I'm done living like that, so I sat in the passenger seat and I did something I'd never done in my life. I stopped trying to be nice about my own survival. I opened my notes and started drafting a statement like I was writing a discharge summary for a toxic patient. Date, time, event, what happened, what was said, what was threatened, and then I said out loud, we are not going to argue with him in public, we're going to out-document him. And Victor nodded. And then he drove us straight to a printing shop because I wanted something physical in my hands, something that felt real, because when you're in a family like mine, you start feeling like everything is slippery, like you can't prove what happened because it happens behind closed doors. And I wanted a paper trail so solid it could cut someone. And while Victor parked, Amaka said, Okay, I need you to decide something right now. Are we going scorched earth on social media, or are we doing this privately through the bank and lawyers? And I stared at the windshield and said, both, but in the right order. Because here's the thing most people don't understand. Going quiet doesn't make you moral. It makes you convenient. And when someone is threatening your job, your credit, and your future, silence is not peace. Silence is permission. And then my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a group chat I hadn't spoken in for months. Family updates, and the first message was from Kira. Tonight, 8 p.m. Everyone present. We will resolve this like adults. And then my father wrote, no more games. Bring your ID. And my stomach clenched because even reading it felt like being cornered in a hallway. And then my auntie, the one who always says, but he's your father, wrote, please just go and apologize so we can move on. And I stared at that line and laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so predictable. People always ask the wounded person to be the glue, never the person who broke it. And I typed back one sentence. I will not attend any meeting where I am pressured to sign documents. And I hit send, and then the phone started ringing immediately, my father, and I didn't answer because I already had his intimidation in writing and I wasn't giving him a fresh audio clip to twist, so I texted, all communication in writing. And that's when he snapped, you think you're smart? And I replied, no, I think you're desperate. And that right there was the first time I'd ever said it to him plainly, and it felt like taking oxygen back into my own lungs. And then we walked into the printing shop, and it smelled like warm toner and paper dust. And I asked for one thing, a certified copy request template, because Victor had already drafted a formal letter to the lender requesting the full refinance packet. And while they printed, Amaka said, we need one more piece. Your father's video thread is about to drop. We need to neutralize it. And I said, we will. And she said, how? And I looked at her and said, by taking away the surprise. Because surprise is the weapon, it's the blade. And if you take away the surprise, all that's left is their ugly intent. And here's where it gets messy. I called my cousin Brianna back, and she answered breathless like she'd been waiting. Girl, he's about to post. He's pacing. Kira is hyping him up like a hype man, and I said, where are you? And she whispered, I'm at the house. And I said, are you alone? And she said, yeah, I came to pick up something and they're acting crazy. And then she added the line. That made my blood go cold. And Kira keeps saying, make sure you show the signature page. That's the whole point. And I didn't even have to think anymore because now I had confirmation that Kira wasn't just a random young girlfriend. She was an active participant, and I said, Brianna, listen to me carefully. I need you to do one thing. I need you to take a picture of the folder if you can safely, the one labeled property, and I need you to leave. And Brianna hesitated. I can't, they'll see. And I said, then don't. Safety first, but if you can, it changes everything. And she went quiet for a second, and then she said, okay, I'm going upstairs, I'll try. And Amaka grabbed my arm. You're trusting her. And I said, I'm not trusting her. I'm using what she fears. She loves drama, but she hates legal trouble. And Victor said, keep her on the line. And I did. And for about 30 seconds, all I heard was faint footsteps and a door creak and my own heartbeat. And then Brianna whispered, I see it. And I said, describe it. And she said, it's a red folder. It says property in black marker, and there's another paperclip stack. And I said, take the photo and leave now. And I heard a camera click, and then she said, wait, there's something else. There's like a sticky note on top. And I felt my throat tighten. Read it. And Brianna whispered, it says get her to re-sign. Use job pressure. Don't mention guarantor. And I swear my body went weightless for a second, like my spirit stepped out of my skin because that was the smoking gun. That was intent. That was strategy. That was not a misunderstanding. And Amaka's eyes went wide, and Victor said quietly, that's it. And then Brianna hissed, someone's coming, and the call cut off, and I stared at my phone like it might explode. And then it buzzed again, and she texted a single image, blurry but readable, red folder, sticky note. My father's handwriting, because I know his handwriting the way you know the sound of a door slamming, and right there in ink it said what I'd been trying to explain to people who kept telling me to just go apologize. They were not trying to resolve. They were trying to trap. And then I felt something I didn't expect, relief, because when you've been gaslit your whole life, the moment you finally have proof is like someone turning the lights on and realizing you weren't crazy. The room really was full of snakes, and I turned to Victor and said, we have intent. And Victor nodded. We now have leverage, and Amaka said, now we choose how to drop it. And I made the choice fast. Not because I'm reckless, because hesitation is how they win. I wrote an email to the lender's fraud department with Victor's help. Attached the photo. Attached the voicemail transcript. Attached the text threats. And I wrote one sentence that I knew would light up every risk alarm in their system. I believe my signature may have been obtained under misrepresentation, and I am being pressured to re-sign documents tonight. And then Victor said, now we do the second move. And I said, the public one. And he said, only if necessary. And I looked at my phone because my father's last text was still sitting there. I will show them who you really are. And I realized he wasn't going to stop. He was going to escalate until he got what he wanted or until I broke. And I'm not breaking, so yes, necessary. And I opened my social account, not to rant, not to cry, not to look unstable like he wanted. I posted a calm statement with 3 bullets. I am being pressured to sign documents relating to a mortgage I did not agree to. I have retained counsel. Any video posted of me will be edited context and is being used to intimidate me. And I didn't mention his girlfriend's age. I didn't insult her because the point isn't to look petty. The point is to look credible. And then I did the last thing that felt almost cinematic. I scheduled the post, but didn't publish yet, because I wanted to see if he would still go through with posting his video after knowing the lender had been contacted, and within 10 minutes, like clockwork, Kira texted me. Why are you emailing the bank? You're making this bigger than it needs to be. And I replied, I'm making it accurate. And she sent, delete that, you'll regret it. And I sent back, threats don't work anymore. And then my father called and I ignored it and he texted, you are dead to me if you do this. And I looked at those words and felt something settle deep in my chest, because that sentence is supposed to shatter you. It's supposed to make you crawl back and beg. But all it did was prove what I'd been refusing to admit for years. He didn't love me like a daughter. He loved me like a resource, and when resources stop producing, owners get angry. And that's the moral lesson right there that I need you to really sit with, because if you're watching this and your family only loves you when you're useful, that's not love. That's a contract, and contracts end when you stop signing them. And then my phone rang again, and this time it was an unknown number, and I almost didn't pick up, but Victor nodded. Answer, on speaker, record. And I answered, hello, and a woman's voice said, this is the lender's compliance team. We received your email. Do not attend any signing tonight, and we are placing an immediate hold on the file. And I felt my knees go weak, because that single sentence was the first real protection I'd gotten. And then she added, if anyone contacts you to pressure you, document it. And if you believe fraud occurred, you may need to file a police report. And Victor thanked her and ended the call. And Amaka exhaled like she'd been holding air for an hour. And I sat there in the car with my palms flat on my thighs like I was grounding myself. And I whispered, he can't move the file. And Victor said, not without scrutiny. And Amaka said, now watch how they behave when their leverage disappears. And right on cue, my father's tone changed. The next text he sent wasn't rage. It was pleading dressed as authority. Come home. We need to talk privately. And I stared at that and laughed again, because privately is where they can twist you. Privately is where there are no witnesses. Privately is where your memory becomes wrong. And I typed back everything in writing. And then Kira sent a voice note, and I didn't even play it. I just saved it. And I thought about all the people who tell you, but he's your father. Like that phrase is a shield against consequences. And I need you to answer me honestly. If a stranger tried to manipulate you into a $450,000 trap, would you still be expected to keep the peace? Or would you protect yourself and call it what it is? And that's why family loyalty is the biggest scam on earth when it's one way. Loyalty is not obedience. Loyalty is not silence. Loyalty is mutual respect. And if it's not mutual, it's not loyalty, it's control. And I'm telling you the truth. The moment I stopped chasing my father's approval, my whole life got quieter in the best way. And just when I thought the night was done, Brianna texted again. Kira is packing a suitcase. And I stared at that because it hit me. She wasn't in love. She was in position, and when the position got unstable, she was ready to run. And then Brianna sent one more message that made my heart drop. Dad is telling everyone you stole money from him. And I looked at Victor and said, here comes the smear. And Victor nodded. And now we use the post. And my finger hovered over publish. And before I hit it, I want you to Ask yourself what you would do, because the next move is the difference between a private family dispute and a public collapse. Do you protect your reputation quietly and hope they stop, or do you go public with proof and let them drown in their own lies? Because as much as I wanted peace, I wanted safety more, and safety sometimes looks like telling the truth loudly before someone else tells a lie louder, and I hit publish. And within minutes my phone started lighting up like a slot machine. Relatives, unknown numbers, my mother, and one message from my father that was so short it was almost funny. "You think you won?" And I whispered, "No," staring at the screen. "I think I survived." And then Victor said, "Now we wait for the lender packet." And Amaka said, "And when that packet comes, we're going to see exactly whose signature is real, whose stamp is fake, and who's been lying to the whole family." And my phone buzzed one more time, not a text, a notification. New upload from Dad. And my stomach tightened because even with the hold, he was still going to try the public route, and the thumbnail was my face mid-blink. The worst frame, the most manipulative, the perfect "see how crazy she looks" frame. And I looked at Victor and said, "He posted it anyway." And Victor's voice went calm and lethal. "Good." And I said, "Good." And he said, "Because now he just gave us evidence of malice." And I opened the video and my father's voice filled the speakers, soft, wounded, theatrical. I never wanted to do this, and I watched for 10 seconds, just long enough to see the edits, just long enough to see the missing context, just long enough to realize he'd cut out the part where he rushed me, cut out the part where Kira threatened my job, cut out the part where he told me, "Bring your ID," and I closed the video and I smiled. Not because I was happy, because I finally understood the endgame. He wasn't trying to clear his name, he was trying to break me, and if you're still here right now, I need you to tell me in the comments, do you think a parent who weaponizes the internet against their own child deserves forgiveness? Or do you think the only safe response is distance and consequences? Because the next thing that happened after that upload was the part one didn't expect at all. The lender packet arrived sooner than anyone promised. And it wasn't just one signature page in there, it was multiple versions, multiple dates, and one name on a notary log that made Victor go completely silent.